Yeah, you got it. Yeah, actually, we think the journal
Oh, share the session. So I'm just going to show you 10 minutes.
What's it?
1 hour.
1 hour.
30 minutes.
Okay. What was just 1 hour? Just 1 hour and 5 additional minutes.
All right, welcome back, everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce our plenary speaker, Dr. Stephan Meylan. Stephan started his academic career at Brown, continued as a PhD student with a PhD at the University of California, Berkeley in the Cognitive Science Department. And spent time as research scientist at MIT, working with Roger Levy and Erica Bergson and colleagues, and is now back in California. And we have the distinct pleasure to hear his amazing talk today on modeling language acquisition as speech development. Stephan has done work at the intersection of computational psycholinguistics, cognitive science, robotics, AI, and is really interested in both first language acquisition and the language processing in adults, and has been building really exciting models and approaches that span both speech science, AI, reinforcement learning, cognitive science, and of course, linguistics. And please join me in welcoming Stephan.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me here today. So it's been really wonderful to see all of this really cool work at the interface of phonology and deep learning. And I'm super excited to talk about some of the stuff that I've been working on. So I want to start today by noting that I'm particularly honored to give today's plenary at the AMP special session on deep phonology, as I do not consider myself a phonologist per se, perhaps you've guessed, but rather something of a developmental cognitive scientist or developmental psycholinguist. So the big question in my research is, how do children learn to use language? How do children learn their native language from exposure to only tens of millions of words of input? How do children learn to use the system well enough to be able to coordinate and act with other humans? And how do children learn at all levels of linguistic representation? So though I'm not a phonologist, I am kept awake in the middle of the night by at least a subset of similar questions. Sort of what is the nature of linguistic representation? Where do those representations come from, et cetera? And so I'll approach these questions from the perspective of computational cognitive science. I think you'll see a certain similarity to what John showed earlier in his talk just before the poster session, but let's see where we go to. So now, of course, something really remarkable has happened in the last few years where computational models have learned to use language well enough to serve as interlocutors in a pretty wide variety of tasks. So I speak, of course, of LLMs and more recently multimodal LLMs that are able to process linguistic signals in real time and provide some sort of contextually appropriate signals in return. We also have a number of what I'll call moderate-sized deep neural models of academic interest. I'm trying to get this acronym to catch on. It might work, might not. But these are a few generations old and in some ways a little bit less impressive, but they're small enough to train locally and they still exhibit very interesting linguistic behaviors. So models like BERT, Hubert, GPT-2, CLIP, Whisper, et cetera. So now it's worth putting in common ground why these systems work, they show where we can get in language with some very general purpose computational tools from computer science and cognitive science. So we have things like deep neural networks, Bayesian modeling, and reinforcement learning. I think they also reflect, and it's worth saying this, that they also reflect growth in resources like increasing compute and huge data sets. We can only really have a 15 trillion token corpus after widespread internet usage. We really couldn't have that before. So these models are impressive, but I think there's still a huge open question from the perspective of linguistics. Now, just because these models end up with some of the same communicative skills in certain contexts as humans, that doesn't necessarily shed light on the way that humans come to learn. Now, obviously, there are huge differences in the scale and the type of data that we use to train LLMs versus what children encounter in their environments. Okay, but that said, I think there's some very important theoretical questions raised by the successes of LLMs and other deep learning-based approaches to language. And so the one I want to look at in a little bit more depth today is that I think these models should prompt us towards a critical reevaluation of any sort of bipartite distinction between speech and language. So now I think this might be an audience where many of you were not all that convinced of that distinction to begin with. But my impression is that these ideas still kick around in linguistics, and it would be a pretty good idea to try to articulate some alternative to that. So the alternative I want to explore today is this. Rather than seeing speech processing and production as auxiliary processes to some more fundamental knowledge of language, with these LLMs, we start to see a system in which fundamental abstract rules of language are emergent as the representations that support real-time usage. So text-based language models don't speak and process speech, but with just a few architectural extensions that I'll show today, we can make them. So if I'm going to distill this position into a boorish slogan, it would be something like linguistic representations are the solution, not the problem. The goal of acquisition isn't to arrive at the same representations as the mature members of the speech community, but rather the goal is to get other humans, the developmental problem is to get other humans to do stuff and to know stuff. So it's actually a solution, language is actually a solution to the anthropological challenges to arrive at some shared library of how to encode and decode messages. So today I just want to show some empirical work where I think this perspective might give us some very useful degrees of freedom. And just as an aside, I want to clarify that by speech, I mean any sort of real-time language production and processing in any modality. I think that's a slightly idiosyncratic use of it. But I want everything that I talk about today to work for sign languages as well. Okay, so I want to describe the classical view, a classical bipartite view of language versus speech with a bit more care. And then there's certain aspects of that position that I think that we want to preserve in our theories going forward. So as an example of the classical view, we can look at Chomsky's bipartite distinction between linguistic competence and linguistic performance. So on the one hand, we have linguistic competence as this sort of internalized, idealized internal knowledge of a language. It's characterized by systematicity and compositionality. And by contrast, we have linguistic performance, where we have processing constraints, practice effects, item-specific knowledge, etc. So speech, in some sense, is then treated as the realization or deployment of language, involving all where it sort of hits the vagaries of the real world. And so any observed behavior, speech production or speech processing, reflects competence filtered through performance. Now, Chomsky doesn't say that performance is unimportant, but he emphasizes that linguistic competence can, because it can be so much richer than real-time realization, is the proper object of study. Now, I want to note that Chomsky isn't alone in thinking in these terms. I think we can go back further and look at Ferdinand de Saussure, who makes a bipartite distinction between langue and parole. By langue, he meant abstract social codes or the stable conventions within a community. And to parole, he apportioned individual speech acts that are contingent and contextual. So there are some important differences to Chomsky here. I don't want to gloss over those too much, but I don't think Saussure was ever really suggesting this as a model for the individual. He wasn't really proposing a theory of psycholinguistics for the individual learner processor. But with Saussure, even more so than Chomsky, you can see this privileging of langue, of the systematic rule-based aspects of language as the appropriate focus of linguistic inquiry. So here's a quote best translated as, the true and unique object of linguistics is langue considered in and of itself. Now, I want to make clear that both of these distinctions, Chomsky's and Saussure's, are perfectly interesting and worthwhile constraints on inquiry. And I think they're in fact necessary for certain domains of linguistics. You can think about the necessity of conceiving of languages as unitary constructs for developing grammars. But there's some sort of formal elegance, I should say, under structuralist thought to think of them as these sort of unitary constructs. But what I'm going to argue today is it's not what works for building an individual agent who's learning to use language to get things done in the real world. Oops, sorry, I fell behind in my animations there. Okay. And because, quite simply put, we see no such distinction in the architecture of our deep neural language models. It does not seem to be architecturally necessary, nor does it seem to have much explanatory virtue when we look at the function of our LLMs, including those that are capable of producing speech. So here I'll put up an example of a transformer architecture predicting the next word. The transformer blocks here are mapping inputs to outputs. Certain transformer blocks are going to capture more abstract regularities, but there's no two-stage process here, and there's no separable core of linguistic competence. Linguistic representations emerge in order to minimize some sort of usage-based loss. And here in the vanilla LM, just predicting what linguistic events the learner is likely to encounter. And then, of course, we do have a number of general purpose architectural constraints. Modern networks use all sorts of information theory guided losses, additional auxiliary losses to guide learning. But it's worth noting that there's nothing specific to language for almost all these losses. That we see a reuse of a lot of losses that come from vision networks, for example. Okay, so deep neural models don't have a strong distinction, but surely we want some sort of orienting framework, and we want to preserve something about the importance of formal abstraction. So the alternative that I want to articulate today is that we can conceive of language processing and production as skills, and that we can borrow a bunch of ideas from robotics in order to understand how linguistic representations relate to tasks. So this is the mental model of the child or language learning model as a robot trying to achieve some set of communicative goals. So internal to the individual speaker listener, we'll posit that they have some noisy sensors, and what they say maps to a representation of the world. They have what we'll call a policy. I'll use this term from reinforcement learning, which maps the world state to an action or sequence of actions that maximizes the future reward. And then they'll have noisy actuators. So even if a speaker intends to trill their R, sometimes it just won't come out that way. And this is what conspires to produce actions. And here we'll mostly talk about linguistic actions, but I want you to see that there's the possibility that an agent of this sort could be doing all sorts of different things in response to linguistic input. And then we're going to be quite careful thereafter to distinguish between how these actions may be interpreted by the researcher, who is trying to infer the properties of the policy, the sensor, or the actuators, trying to figure out what all these latent variables might be, versus what the action yields in terms of reward or utility from communication from others, because that's the actual signal that might be used to parameterize this. So now, as I said, I'm borrowing some vocabulary from reinforcement learning, which is a machine learning paradigm where we have an agent and an environment, and the agent takes some actions that change the state of the environment, and this yields a new estimation of the state of the changed world and potentially some reward. Now, notably, an interlocutor, another speaker or listener, is just a complex, dynamic part of that environment that can be addressed by a subtype of actions. So just to clarify, modern reinforcement learning is very far from the sort of thing that Chomsky critiqued back in B.F. Skinner's Verbal Behavior in 1959. Modern RL handles very long delays before rewards, highly stochastic rewards, the discovery of all sorts of sub-goals, et cetera. And just as an example, under modern reinforcement learning, learners can learn to estimate likely reward with all sorts of rich cognitive models and improve their policy through simulation, as well as learn their policies across a large number of heterogeneous tasks. I also want to sort of head off the question of whether the policy space is constrained. I just want to make it perfectly clear that I think that there are aspects of human physiology, information theory, the pragmatic constraints on the use of language, energy costs in producing speech, that there are many different reasons to think that large parts of that potential policy space are just clearly dispreferred, that that's just not a good way to try to encode or decode a message. Okay. So under this skill model, we've eliminated the strong bipartite distinction. There are just representations within the policy that are useful in mapping in the mapping of inputs to outputs. And so here I want to draw a parallel to something like tennis. That in learning tennis, one improves at perceiving the game, one improves at planning, and one improves in motoric execution, all in order to maximize reward or some internal approximation of reward. So I think under this framework, it becomes harder to conceive of a separate notion of competence or a notion of competence that's separate from performance. What makes for a better tennis player is better sensors, a better policy, and less bad actuation. It really would not make much sense for me to say I'm a world-class tennis player in terms of competence. I'm just lacking in performance. Now, there's another reason that I like this comparison to tennis, which is that I think it actually gives us a degree of freedom in what we can consider as policies, that the tennis player should be expected to transition through various ad hoc, transitory, good enough policies until the pressures of the game make them all look relatively similar. But even then, individuals should be expected to vary to a certain extent. So the parallel here for child language would be that we would expect that the same sort of transition, we should expect the same sort of transitions through ad hoc, good enough policies for encoding and decoding speech, and then end up with something along the lines of isomorphic grammars, ones that are sufficiently communicative and sufficiently conventional, but don't necessarily need to have to be exactly the same. Okay, we can then apportion some of the variability in real-time outcomes, processing and production, to noise and sensors and actuators. We can also think about limitations that might emerge from the computational costs of deciding the best action under a policy. So just to go back to the tennis player one more time, we might be able to come up with a tennis player might be able to come up with a better plan, but they might not have the time to rigorously consider all possible plans for what they're doing on the court. The last parallel I want to draw to the tennis player is that the learner is going to have some aspects of their policy that are super fine-tuned and some that are much more general. So we can retain some of the nice advantages of the Chomskyan or Saussurean emphasis on abstraction without making a strong bipartite distinction within this skill framework. And so we can assert that instead the policy has something along the lines of a generalizability spectrum in the sorts of representations and sort of directions that it provides to the agent. So we can think of an individual's knowledge of language as it's captured within a policy on a spectrum of more specific to more abstract in general. So on the specific end of the spectrum, I might have an expectation that certain speakers will approximate the voiced interdental fricative. I might have a preference to say strength or length to fit in my speech community. And also on the more specific side, but going farther away from phonology, I might have lexically specific knowledge that take off means something idiosyncratic when planes do it. On the more abstract or general end of the spectrum, I might expect that all nouns are going to behave somewhat similarly syntactically, or I might infer that most words in a language are going to be composed of the same fairly small inventory of sounds and sound sequences. That is, I could develop some pretty strong phonotactic expectations that I expect to hold across the lexicon as I encounter new words. So just to make it clear under this view, all of these are cashed out as expectations, and these expectations help me make decisions that will maximize reward in speech and speech processing. And later on, especially through education, we can think about how this might extend to other modalities of language use. Okay, so now I want to jump back here and think about how instruction-tuned text-based LLMs fit within this framework. What I want to argue is that they're just a special case, that they have a policy and they have a generalizability spectrum, but that they have a sort of minimal noise in sensors and actuators. So because their input stream is, I'm talking about text-based LLMs here for a second, but because their input is a stream of discrete tokens of a finite size symbolic inventory, and their outputs are the same, that's just a very simple input and output space in comparison to the real world. The other important difference is that even if they're trained in the end within some sort of reinforcement learning loop, we generally do huge amounts of pre-training where we're trying to do something very simple like next word prediction, just to have good enough representations around to be able to get anywhere with that reinforcement learning task. Okay. Well, what I want to argue today is that we can push towards language models and much further in the direction of robotics that restores these two components in order to interact with the richness of signal in the real world. We can make our models receive raw multimodal input, for example, using convolutional neural network, auditory and vision networks, and we can make them produce raw multimodal output. We can use a locomotion CNN to control a vocal tract simulator. And then we'll actually, so I'm not saying that we're going to attach these to existing LLMs, rather we're going to use similar architectures for that middle part, for the policy, and see what we can do just in terms of that operating in a simulation of the real world. Okay, and if we do all these things, then we're in a position to build full stack models of speech processing and production. That is, models that receive waveforms, process them, activate appropriate representations within a decision-making framework, and then encode a message using some sort of expressive subnetwork, for example, learning to move a vocal tract. And if we want to do this well, we'll need to capture some of the privileged linguistic abstractions within the decision-making network. Hence the claim that we can model language acquisition as speech development directly. This will also raise new questions about what sort of abstractions best emerge from these raw signals when we don't commit to a priori symbolic representations of the input and output stream. Okay, so that was my part one, my broad argument that we can model language acquisition as speech development, and some justification for my optimism that consequential linguistic abstractions can emerge under this approach. And here's my plan for the rest of today's talk. So I'm going to talk about speech processing and production under an action perception loop and try to make some of these parallels to robotics a little bit clearer. And then I'm going to talk about two projects of my own that take advantage of this way of thinking about linguistic representations. So I'll try to answer the question first of what are criteria for good enough speech production skills in development. And then in the final part, I'll ask how we can imitate this process of skill acquisition, which will have some corollary questions there of how do receptive and expressive language skills relate to one another, and how do linguistic representations relate to task demands. Okay, so let me continue up here with speech processing and production as skills in the action perception loop. And I'll be brief, as I'm sure you all are tiring of boxes and arrows and want to see some figures with results in the near future. But just to put a little bit more color on this computation forward idea for acquisition, I just want to relate it to a simple model of grounded communication. So first, I'll start with an action perception loop, which is just a very common way in the cognitive sciences to think about how any agent might perceive and interact with its environment. So children, for example, learn to interact with their environment in exactly such a loop. And here, I want to start with a very simple action space. Let's say that the child can look towards something, they can locomote, they can grasp. And each of these have some sort of environmental consequence, which is then visible to the child. Now, I'm going to elaborate on that action loop in two different ways. The first is to make it dyadic. That is that we're concerned with two or really more different agents because children learn in large part through interactions with caregivers, siblings, and other people more generally. So I'm going to add a second agent to this. And then I'm going to assert that they actually coexist within the same environment, such that whatever actions they take affect the same environment, and that changes to the environment are often observable to both agents. The second change I'm going to make to the action perception loop is to distinguish between linguistic and non-linguistic actions. So I'm going to introduce a special subtype of actions that don't really affect the environment directly, but rather these communicative actions that affect the current or future actions of another agent. So I'll draw these two lines here and delineate them with this inner box as communication. Very importantly, note that this is bidirectional. And just to clarify, I don't mean that all of these routes are used simultaneously. With this figure, I'm just trying to enumerate the possible data routes in this dyad. Now, in the case of natural languages, the communicative actions take a very special form. We can think of them as speakers encoding information in a signal and listeners decoding that same signal. Here in the dyad, we have these sort of matched pairs of encoding and decoding. By encoding and decoding, I mean that there are conventional ways in which speakers and listeners have to modulate the linguistic signal in order to convey meaning. Which, as you all know, is encoded according to something along the lines of levels of linguistic representation. So that is hierarchical, multi-scale structure, going from conversations and discourse at the top all the way down to sound categories and acoustics down at the bottom. And so you all can see a very privileged position here for phonology, that it's an absolutely critical part of this encoding and decoding process. So all this machinery gives us some ways to represent some very sophisticated learning. So for example, if a child wants a cookie, they might encode this with they might encode this message using their knowledge of all those levels of language representation. The caregiver then has to decode such a message, like I want a cookie. Then on the basis of what they recover, choose an action, in this case, grasping and possibly some locomotion, and they change the environment on behalf of the child. This change to the environment is then visible to the child, possibly achieving their original goal. If this worked, then they probably want to keep their encoder as it is. And if not, they want to consider alternative policies for how to encode their message. How to transition around the space of how to possibly encode and decode messages, that's of course the hard part. Okay, finally, I'm going to redraw the child's encoder and decoder here with fuzzy edges to emphasize that the child's representation might start as something very different than its eventual mature form. That this is a skill that the child is progressively acquiring. I want to stress that this is very different than this is very different than the criteria for success under generative linguistics as replication of that encoder that is copying the adult grammar. Here we have a much more anthropological criterion for success, that the message has to be encoded well enough that it can be decoded by that conspecific, by that adult mature listener, and likewise that the child can decode the adult's productions well enough. Now let me just map those labels that I had previously for skills onto this representation of the dyad. So the child's choices regarding how to encode and decode messages represents two aspects of the child's linguistic policy. We have a place here for the noisy actuators and speech production on the top, and for noisy sensors and speech decoding on the bottom. And we have an idea of reward or utility that can come from successfully transmitting messages in either direction. So if you're curious, Elke Bergelsen and I worked out this perspective for a bit for an annual review of linguistics article a few years ago, looking specifically at early word learning. But what I'm going to talk about today is much more general. This is an idea for how to push forward on speech processing and speech production. Now, obviously, where I'm going to go here is that I'm going to talk about how we can model children, how children find a good policy. But before that, I want to talk a little bit about the adult caregiver, because how they interpret children's speech is going to be really consequential for the content of that learner's policies. And so that brings me to part 3. What are the criteria for good enough speech production skills in development? Before we know what's a good policy or what utility a child would have for a given policy, we want to have some rigorous model of how it's received by caregivers as mature users of the language. And so this is work that I published in 2023 in Nature Human Behavior. And I want to acknowledge my co-authors on this work, Ruthie Fouché, Nicole Wong, Elke Bergelsen, and Roger Levy. So my co-author, Ruthie, and I were riding the T in Boston, watching how a mother was listening ever so attentively to her child and translating quite unreasonable babble into well-formed recommendations for when to get off the T. And we started to notice the following. So Ruthie and I were talking, we started to think that the literature didn't really account for this. Instead, we see this sort of asymmetry, that if we map that literature, if we map the literature onto the action perception loop that I showed earlier, we see that there are sort of thousands of studies and dozens of models relating to the child encoder, that is child language production, and thousands of studies and dozens of models concerning the child's encoder, how the child makes sense of the adult speech. And then, of course, there's a lot of work on the adult encoder. What's the nature of adult speech to children, and how might that influence the language learning process? But then there's been vanishingly little work up here concerning the adult decoder. How is it that adults listen to and act upon children's productions? I've noted an exhaustive list of all 3 previous experimental or observational studies on adult speech recognition of children's speech. And yet, this part of the system is potentially really critical for shaping the input to the child, because it determines how adults respond, both linguistically as well as non-linguistically. So rigorously characterizing the adult decoder will help us understand what sort of feedback or reward signal might be available to a child. You can possibly imagine very different data on these 2 routes, contingent speech and contingent action, depending on what an adult caregiver is able to find in their child's speech. You can also imagine very different utility to a child depending on whether a caregiver only understands them if they stay really close to the phonology of the adult language versus if the adults are more accommodating and accept highly non-standard pronunciations as discursively valid, at least temporarily. So I want to start with an example of this behavior in the wild. Here's a 23-month-old child in a high chair, and she has a very special request for her mom. I'm going to play this clip once without subtitles. So you'll just hear what the child says, and I want you to try and figure out what she's saying. And I did test this earlier, but I feel like there's always the possibility it won't work in real time. So let's give this a try. I want to walk the rabbit's back. Okay. In the second clip, I'm going to show the same, but I'm going to let you hear the mother's interpretation afterwards.
You want to wash doggy while his spots off?
Okay, so that's what the parent heard from the child. And now thirdly, I'll play it again and show subtitles. I want to wash the rabbit's back.
You want to wash doggy while his spots off?
Yeah.
I never heard you say that.
It's cute. So from these videos, besides how cute they are, we can see that children's speech deviates in many ways from the adult conventions. It's filled with false starts. The child is talking incredibly slowly. There are all sorts of missing phonemes and approximations, and what she's saying is slightly bizarre. And yet, caregivers, and I suspect many of you, are perfectly able to recover some message from the child. So how can we make a model of the adult listener that acts like adults in this respect? So within this framework, can we make a sort of child-directed listening model that can imitate an adult? It would be exceptionally useful moving forward if we could realistically model that aspect of adult feedback on these routes. Okay, so for this, we can start with a framework called noisy channel communication. I think it'll be familiar for many of you in the audience, that has been used for a long time in psycholinguistics, phonology, and signal processing and robotics and many other fields. So here we have a source, person 1, who encodes a message as a speaker, produces some signal, which gets corrupted by noise, and then their listener has to infer what they meant on the basis of that signal, plus some sophisticated inference. And this has been a really successful way to conceive of inference in adult speech at many different levels of linguistic representation. Now, the question is, how can we model these sophisticated inferences when it comes to children? So from first principles, we might think about what sort of information sources adult listeners have at their disposal. We might think, for example, that adults could consider how children are likely to mispronounce words. We know that some sounds like the or the are really hard, and that children might approximate those until their motor skills develop. Adults could very easily learn that kind of pattern. A second point is that even before the adults hear any vocalizations on the part of the child, they have pretty strong beliefs about what children are likely to communicate based on linguistic and non-linguistic context. So this factoring lends itself quite naturally to Bayesian inference, one of the tools I brought up at the beginning of the talk, which gives us a statistically robust way to evaluate support for hypotheses using observed data. The top point can best be captured by a Bayesian likelihood, and the bottom one corresponds to a Bayesian prior. So this means we can build a Bayesian model of word recognition, very similar to the ones that I explored for adult speech recognition in some of my doctoral work. And Bayes' rule just says that we can make good guesses or estimate a posterior distribution over possible word interpretations if we look at just two components. So the first is the likelihood or the fit of the received phonetic data to the candidate word. And the second is the prior or the probability of that word interpretation given the context. Now, ideally, context would capture everything ever that might be relevant for informing the adult's beliefs about the identity of the word. That is everything with the exception of the phonetic data itself. When I started working on this, it was easiest to just get the linguistic context. What do kids like to talk about? What's present? What sorts of words or phrases are they most likely to use? Now, of course, with multimodal models, now that we have vision language models, there's the possibility of extending this further. But fundamentally, the same principles apply, that if we can approximate these different probabilities, we can build a cognitive model that can interpret words from children's phonetic outputs. And we can see just how close we get to what adult listeners actually find. So this Bayesian approach can help us conceive of two very different adult listeners in terms of the inferences that they would make about a production like Tagi-Wagi. As a first hypothesis, we can imagine a narrow listener where the probability of recovering dog is high only for conventional pronunciations of dog, and these other forms are not interpreted as such. Under the child-directed listening model, by contrast, the adult accepts a much wider range of pronunciations from the child. Gog, da, and tagi-wagi all map to dog under this kind of hypothesis. Now, I think we can all agree that we have some intuition that caregivers for North American English learning children are likely to fall somewhere towards the latter, but the challenge is still to build a model that can replicate those inferences. Okay, so what kind of data can we send to the model and how can we evaluate it? In the video I showed, the mother repeats what she thought her child said. Parents, unfortunately, are generally far too busy to do something like this. Maybe we can ask them afterwards what they think their child meant in certain cases, but it's really quite hard to do that kind of thing at scale. So then we realized that there's a really decent approximation that we have transcribers of child language data sets who have a fairly similar problem. Noisy speech, some idea of what's happening in the scene because they generally have access to a video, at least in this corpus. And then they have a similar task of needing to decide what the child might have said. So here's the corresponding transcript from Childus from that video made by researchers. And very importantly, there are a couple of data sets like the provenance corpus here, collected by Catherine Demuth, that have phonemic annotations of the sounds that children actually produce. So here's an IPA transcription of the child's speech there. So what we can actually do is make a model that takes that phonetic transcript of a word-sized chunk of child speech along with the linguistic context as input and yields a word-level transcript. Which we can then compare to the word level transcript from researchers to see if it recovers the same interpretation. So let me just flag that in this section, I'm going to be talking about phonetic transcriptions as inputs and for our evaluation. But since this paper, we've developed a model that works on waveforms by adapting whisper. I want to also note that dealing with phonetic transcripts across data sets is non-trivial, and a lot of this work was facilitated by some of my previous work, building R and Python tools for making child language corpora more accessible, with a big emphasis on making those phonetic and phonemic transcripts more accessible. Okay, so here's how the modeling works. We take a randomly chosen word length segment of a transcript and mask it out. Then we retrieve the word level transcriptions of all of the utterances around it, or the linguistic context shown here in blue. Then we retrieve the child's phonetic production corresponding to the masked segment from the phonetic transcription. I'll show that here in red. And here I'm looking at the transcript for the video I showed earlier and have selected the segment that transcribers labeled as wash. But what the child actually said was closer to was. And so now we want to compute probabilities for hypotheses regarding an adult's word interpretation, which I'm calling W. Now we use the Bayesian model I just described, which breaks down into two parts. On the top, we have a prior, which predicts the identity of the word from the context, so using all the blue stuff to try to predict what that word would have been, and a likelihood that gives a probability that each possible interpretation would be realized with that phonetic form. Then we just multiply prior and likelihood and normalize to get posterior probabilities. And for evaluation, we can check if the top guess of the model is the same word as what was found by annotators. So if we evaluate this across a large test set, we can get a percentage of top one matches. We can also compute some finer grained probabilistic or information theoretic measures like surprisal. Full stop. There's another advantage of the Bayesian approach, though, which pertains to the goals of modeling in the first place. Now, here I want to say that there are really two separate goals here in trying to model this adult behavior. And the first is that we're trying to replicate the adult behavior to try to find the best model that recovers the same messages that the adults do from children's speech. This will yield a model that we can plug in to future models of the child learner. But then there's also a second goal of trying to understand the contributions of architecture and information source for supporting these sorts of inferences. So in addition to finding the best model, we'll also do a bunch of ablations, that is, evaluate many possible worst priors and likelihoods to see what seems to make the biggest difference in replicating the adult inferences. And of course, the set of options here is going to be theoretically motivated, corresponding to things that psycholinguists and developmental phonologists have suggested before. So the Bayesian factoring of the model will let us compare the probability distributions over guesses. So we'll have a very precise way of comparing the alternatives. And that's what makes it preferable to one giant end-to-end neural model. Okay, so here's the space of possible priors. We can start with a bunch of different model architectures, including transformer and Bayesian models, as well as some very simple baselines like unigram or word frequency models. Transformer models, importantly, will let us capture long-distance topical and syntactic context of use. And then we're going to cross each of these architectures with different training data sets, either child speech, conversational adult speech, or a large sample of adult written language. Finally, we can manipulate the breadth of context used for prediction. So we could use the preceding and following utterances, just the preceding utterances, or limit to within the same utterance. Now, of course, there are some combinations of these factors that don't really make any sense. So for example, we can't vary the context width of a unigram model. So this yields 13 different options for the prior. And evaluating each of these gives us some idea about the marginal improvement from architecture training data or scope of context. Now, there are really too many comparisons here that are potentially of interest. So for my talk today, I just want to call out two endpoints of the space of models. So up here at the top, we have a most sophisticated best predictive prior, a very powerful transformer-based language model with rich representations of topic, of conversational turn, of syntax, of phrase, which has been further fine-tuned on another data set of parent-child interactions. So I'm going to call this the child-directed listening model, and that it instantiates all of those fancy probabilistic expectations that we think adults might make use of when interpreting children's speech. And I want to contrast that prior with one down here at the bottom, something of a narrow listener that assumes a priori that all words are equiprobable. It captures no beliefs about what children are more or less likely to say, which means it has to rely entirely on the phonetic signal, right? So this is the model that can only use what comes out of the child's vocal tract at that point in time in order to interpret what they're producing, and that's going to end up being an important baseline. So that was the space of possible priors. Let me just say something brief about likelihood. It's less complicated. For the likelihood, I used a probabilistic model of mispronunciations. The simplest one here is just an edit distance likelihood. That is that the more substitutions and deletions, and potentially insertions between the child's production and how the adult would produce the word, the less likely. So for example, hearing the child say da is a very unlikely rendering of the word cat because it would require 3 sound substitutions. By contrast, the child producing da is a much more reasonable rendering of dog. That's only 1 deletion, so that'll have a much higher likelihood. But we also want to consider a likelihood that is adapted specifically to children's speech, what I call here a child-adapted likelihood. To do this, we actually fit a probabilistic model, a finite state transducer, using pairs of adult interpretations and phonetically transcribed child words, importantly from a separate corpus. We don't want to overfit here. And that lets us estimate the probability of different substitutions, deletions, insertions for any new child vocalization that we can then use to compute the probability that an intended word would be mispronounced with a particular form. You can imagine approximating this with a neural network, but as I said here, the advantage with the structured probability model is that we can factor it out specifically and we generate a true likelihood here. So just zooming out here for a second, there are 13 priors and 2 likelihoods, and we're interested in what combination matches most frequently with adult interpretations. or a slightly different objective assigns the highest probability to words found by adults. Okay, so now I'm going to show some results, and I'm going to walk through 4 key comparisons, all of which I'll motivate with respect to that Bayesian factoring of the problem. So on the y-axis, I'll show the models, ordering according to what we think will be the most adapted to the child up at the top to least adapted down at the bottom. And then on the x-axis, I'm going to show the proportion of top 1 guesses. That means the further rightwards the bar, the better the model. Within each model, I'm going to plot 3 different results. On top, the full model with the child adapted likelihood. In the middle, the full model with the edit distance likelihood. That's the slightly less the one that's not adapted to child speech particularly. And then finally on the bottom, the prior only model. That is not using the phonetic data produced by the child, but just predicting the word's identity from the context alone. Okay, when I show these results, okay, perfect timing for the bell. So when I show these results, we can see that the models that are better adapted to the child towards the top of the figure are much better at predicting what the transcribers find. If we adapt the linguistic expectations and the pronunciation model, we can recover the same interpretation as the annotator about 90% of the time, which is pretty clear, which is pretty near to the degree of agreement among annotators in the first place, because they don't all agree on how to transcribe things like I want to wash doggy woggy spots off. We can see that the full models using the child adapted likelihoods, the top one of each one of these groups, best captures the human annotations, followed by the edit distance model in the middle. And as we might reasonably expect, models that actually use the vocalization from the child substantively outperform the prior only models. Okay, but now that I've shown that basic pattern, I want to look in a little bit more depth at the contribution of prior beliefs to best model performance. So I want to focus on models that use the better child-adapted likelihood, and we're going to compare the performance of two key priors. So 2A up here at the top is a full child-directed listening model that uses the most informative child-directed listening prior, and 2B down here is a model that uses that least informative narrow listener prior and is entirely reliant on the phonetic input. This was the contrast between endpoint models that I flagged a few slides ago. And the difference in performance here is stark at 90 versus 42%. That is to say that the model with the child-adapted, structurally rich prior is much, much better at reproducing the adult interpretations. So this result suggests that adult listeners are using context and their broader beliefs about language in order to restore or even impose meaning on children's early vocalizations. That's to say a lot of the information isn't in the vocalization itself, if we look at it at any point in time. The third analysis is to directly compare the best prior and the best likelihood. So here we can compare 3A, an uninformative likelihood in combination with the best prior, and 3B, the best likelihood with an uninformative prior. And this reveals something super striking, a striking difference of recovering 60% versus 42% of the annotator's transcriptions. So that is to say that the best context-only model better predicts the adult interpretations than the model that actually observed what the child said for this segment. I want to say that again because I think it's really striking. That's the best context-only model up there at the top better predicts the adult's interpretations than the model that actually observed what the child said for this segment. I need you to think for a moment what that means for learning. That means that the children have a huge amount of leeway in how they realize their speech productions for them to be discursively useful. The final research question I want to address with these results is what matters for adult interpretations. Here I'm going to show the incremental improvement from more sophisticated priors. All but the first one of these is going to be fit to the child language. So I'll start by highlighting 4A down here, where the model has no prior knowledge. This is correct near 0% of the time. In 4B, word frequency, which just guesses the most frequent word produced by children. This will give us 3% over the baseline. Tracking multi-word utterances, just the 2 preceding words to predict the next word, simple trigram model with some smoothing, offers a 26% absolute gain over the preceding. When we use a model that handles syntax within an utterance, so a transformer model, but just looking within the same utterance, we get another 7%. For E, when we can use a model that can see a longer window of preceding discourse, so 20 utterances before the current one, that adds another 16% absolute improvement, suggesting that topical information is really, really important for these adult inferences. And then finally in 4F, using a bidirectional model of context offers another 8%. I'm happy to talk in questions about why it makes sense to evaluate a bidirectional model. So this gives us some idea about what aspects of structure are the most important for adults who are trying to recover meaning from children's super noisy early speech. Okay, so just to summarize the results from this work on how adults understand children. First, adults adapt to children's pronunciations, and we can build a model that captures this to a fairly high degree of fidelity. Second, that adults use strong beliefs about what children are likely to say in order to drive their interpretations. Third, these expectations seem to make an even larger contribution than adapting to pronunciations. And fourth, we can see that what really seems to matter for replicating the interpretation of children's speech, of course, tracking syntax helps, but tracking topics and discourse at an even broader level seems to help even more. I want to throw in a fifth result, which I didn't get a chance to go over today, which is that if we can further adapt both parts of the model to specific children, and we can get even closer to what annotators find. Take a look at the paper if you're curious about that, or ask questions afterwards. But zooming out here, we can summarize that adults are really good at making sense of children's early errorful speech. So if I bring this back to this tale of two listeners, we have evidence of child-directed listening. And furthermore, we have a computational model that we can plug into a model of the child learner. And I just want to stress that everything I've shown here is for text-based phonetic transcript, symbolic representations of phonetic transcriptions, but it's pretty trivial to fine-tune an automatic speech recognition system, Whisper, to start to look a lot more like these adults in terms of upweighting some of its hypotheses. So if we look back at this schematic, we can start to simulate this adult decoder within a larger framework. Okay, so returning to this skill-based reinforcement learning framework for language acquisition, the upshot of all of this is that we have a simple model of reward/utility, at least for referential contexts. And we can return to the question of how does the child learn a good policy? Bringing us to the fourth part of the talk, how can we imitate this process of skill acquisition? This is new work with Jasper Begish here at Berkeley, and this is the content of a perpetually delayed preprint. If you've seen me give variants of this talk before, you'll know it's always due in about 2 weeks. And I'm going to point out the hard part when we get to it, and you'll appreciate why this is a challenge. Okay, so earlier I said that with this new skill-based RL framework, along with deep neural networks, we can start to imagine these full stack models of speech processing in production. And here I want to return to the problem of representations. So what's a good representational format for early acquisition that's rich enough that we can revise it into a mature speaker listener? So we talked earlier about how linguistics factors representations and expectations into these sort of discrete levels. And very often it tries to characterize these in terms of some symbolic representation. Now, these symbolic representations are notoriously hard to work with in early development. So what happens to a learner's estimates of word sequence probabilities if they need to realize that they need to posit more words? How do you update your history of experience if the discrete units have changed? There are, of course, rules by which you can do that, but that seems to be an approximation, and nobody's figured out how to do it yet. So the problem here is that potentially all of these units are changing over the course of early development. So what we really need is some sort of representational format that will allow us to accumulate and revise knowledge at all of these levels simultaneously. So here's my proposal. So what if we just allow for multi-scale hierarchy in motor programs on the vocal tract and in waveforms? Perhaps we don't actually need to hard code any information about these levels of representation, but rather expect that such representations might emerge quite naturally within a neural network as a best solution to efficiently compose and decompose a continuous speech signal. So then we can think of the child's task as needing to infer a compact library of reusable components for moving a vocal tract in order to get people to do stuff. So phonemes, morphemes, words, sentences, all of these are entities in our description language, and they do a pretty good job of characterizing the organization of motor programs, but we're actually going to give it a little degree of freedom around that they might look a little bit different. So this lets us bring a completely different set of models to bear in this task. We can use relatively simple convolutional neural networks that have been previously used to look at locomotion and grasping. And now there are a bunch of nice connections to other literatures here. I should say first, the motor theory of speech perception, to which this has some relationship, but I can talk about the distinctions if anyone's curious. In child language acquisition, especially in the 80s and 90s, there's some very interesting evidence that a lot of children's early linguistic knowledge corresponds only poorly to units in the adult grammar. There's a lot of work suggesting a continued importance of motor action in the hindbrain in the human language faculty, even for the most abstract aspects of it. And of course, there's all sorts of research in machine learning and robotics for people who are interested in how to discover sort of generative programs. So that is like what's a compositional program that can generate a set of observations. This is a very difficult search space in general because just there's so many different things you can do once you have a lot of compositionality. But people are starting to make progress on it, especially with approaches like Bayesian program induction. So one of the biggest advantages of conceiving of children in dealing in multi-scale intervals without being too strong about the commitments is that it allows us to capture a bunch of empirical results where children seem to have to use multi-word sequences, but sort of leave their content under analyze. So per the work of Imbal Arnon, we have some evidence that a lot of English learning kids will know what brush your teeth means and know what it means in terms of what they need to do in everyday life, but that's before they know what brush or teeth mean individually. So this model allows us to attach communicative significance to larger chunks of speech without fully understanding their compositional properties. So this is going to give the child some time to analyze and refine their compositional understanding of some of these longer sequences, even as they're able to use the larger chunks in order to achieve some early communicative goals. So this is very different from the sort of standard bottom-up compositionality, where we have combinations of a symbolic inventory that are governed by some strict rules. And here the learner can simultaneously analyze how any interval can be composed upwards with other intervals, or how it can be analyzed downwards into subintervals. Okay, so that'll give us some representational flexibility, but we're still going to have a compute problem that means that standard reinforcement learning likely still won't work. And that's that there's simply too many things you can do with a vocal tract, such that seeing whether adults do the right thing will take more time than the universe has left. So if the adult doesn't do the right thing, this is sort of a classic problem in child language acquisition, that if the adult doesn't do the right thing, what should the child change about their hypotheses about how to encode a message? This is quite close to that critique that Chomsky originally leveled at Skinner, that language is simply too complex of a behavior to learn through positive and negative feedback. But recall what I said at the beginning of the talk, that in 2025, we have these much more sophisticated notions of reinforcement learning. So what I want to propose today as a solution is that the child's goal isn't to produce speech that satisfies the adult listener directly, that they're not trying to maximize that reward directly. Instead, what they're trying to do is produce speech that satisfies the child's own internal model of the adult listener. So in RL, what we call this the child's value function, or their approximation to the external reward. So one solution here is that the child can reuse their receptive network as an approximation of how they think the adult listener will interpret their speech and work on their productions with respect to that. So this means that a child could develop their policy in large part through self-play, searching for a way to communicate with themselves. So if the child is able to build a predictive model of the adult decoder, piggybacking on how the child has learned to decode productions from the adult, as well as a predictive model of action selection and a predictive model of environmental change, then the child can practice without ever having to actually wait for sparse adult feedback. That is, and then they're actually freed up to use that adult feedback much more efficiently to revise these predictive models. Now, this idea of a predictive model of the adult decoder ends up looking a whole lot like a set of theories that have been really influential in language pragmatics in the last decade, something called rational speech X. RSA says that speakers and listeners recursively reason about one another when they choose what to say. The RL approach here lacks that strong recursion, but it does capture that much more basic kernel that a learner should produce vocalizations in a way that they think listeners will take the desired action or update their beliefs in the desired way. Now, there's much greater data efficiency here. When an adult interprets something differently than intended, the child model can change its encoding policy. That's the sort of vanilla RL, but much more importantly, it can change its decoding policy. It can update its predictive model of how the adult decodes the things that the child model says. The one other thing we can set ourselves up for success is to start with a very strong unsupervised model of motor learning on raw speech. So this is where my collaboration with Gasper comes in. Gasper figured out a few years ago how we can get some really nice multi-scale representations for production using a generative adversarial network. So under this model, convolutional neural net or CNN generator network tries to trick a CNN discriminator. The discriminator tries to get better at distinguishing the model-generated audio from real audio, and in time, this results in reproducing the set of waveforms with pretty high fidelity. And then furthermore, this model has to satisfy a communicative objective, that it's encoding and decoding these different messages to a low-dimensional space, which pushes the network towards self-consistency, and it learns a small representational space to generate all the possible word forms. So here's the model, and I would just want to walk you through this starting from the left, that the model starts with an arbitrary message in the low-dimensional space. The generator CNN then produces an electromagnetic articulography track, which then gets sent through a vocal track simulator to produce a waveform. Then, alternatingly, the model evaluates if it can recover the intended message and back propagates to adjust the generator and recognizer so that it meets this objective. And then alternatingly, the waveform is sent through the child's discriminator, which just checks if a production was from the model or the child. And so the model will then update the generator to better fool the discriminator by producing progressively more and more adult-like productions. So that's not conditioned. Importantly, that second part is not conditioned on the message. That's just say things that sound like the other things around you say, right? So there's no relationship to message, but we can make what's really nice about a model like this is that it can actually make advances on both of those independently and explore that hypothesis space, that sort of policy space much more efficiently. So this model learns to produce waveforms corresponding to different parts of the message space through self-play. And very importantly, it has done so by inferring a very compact hierarchical set of representations of speech in the generator, exactly what our RL learner needs to start with. Now, importantly, there's no notion of a referent up in this unsupervised version of the model. So what we need to do now is make sure that the child's listening model starts to approach the listening model of its adult interlocutors. Okay, so that's the high-level overview of the solutions that will let us bring reinforcement learning to speech processing and production. Now I just want to talk about a task and show some results and discuss some advantages of this approach. So to go back to this view, we saw a lot of potential complexity in adult contingent action. But let's consider for a second a reference game where the child needs to name one of a small number of visually salient possible reference. In this case, we can slot in that model of the adult's decoder, for example, using that whisper-based ASR network tuned for child productions, per what we've developed in that last project on child-directed listening. And in a simple reference game, the rest of the loop is going to be quite easy to model. That action selection is trivial. The adult will simply choose the named object. So it's just basically a word recognition task. And then the reward model is trivial, that there's just positive reward for the caregiver picking the referent that was intended by the child. So we can put a neural network pretty easily into a model like this. Now, the other advantage of the reference game is in its reversibility. So on the last slide, I showed a reference game where the model child names an object, and the adult listener tries to choose it from a set of available options. But we can also think about the complementary case where an adult names an object and the child model has to choose among them. So we have ways to both train and evaluate the child model's receptive skills at the same time. So then within the system, there's a very straightforward way to evaluate performance in terms of win rates, how often the correct referent is recovered in either form of the game. We can titrate the difficulty of this by including new images or even new objects in the reference game. So for example, the model never sees a red bird until test, and then it has to generate that with its existing policy. And altogether, this looks quite different from the existing tasks that people use in models of child language development these days, not because of the raw data. That's certainly the new thing. Everybody's using raw data. But what this model has is that dynamic simulation of the adult listener, capturing the contingencies and simulating some of that much more complex reward function in terms of what the adult is willing to entertain as a message at each point in time. Even if it's communicatively successful, there's still that pressure towards trying to sound like the waveforms that are in the input. And so it's still going to have that pressure towards conventionality that's separate from the communicative pressure. Okay. Okay, so just adding that receptive task alone gives us a way to add a supervisory signal. And we can add that task where the child is the listener, and we can simply co-train the child's listening model, their decoding model in the receptive task corresponding to that route that I showed earlier. That is, we can have the child model play as the listener in the reference game, and the second version of the task I just described. So here's the modeling. We just take an adult word form, we send it through the child's listening model to recover a message, provide the child model with the adult's actual intention. I'll show you how we send that soft label data through in a second, then back propagate to adjust the child's decoder. And I'll talk about how we do this with images on the next page. So this will ensure that the child's decoder is largely consistent with the adult encoder, and we can use that then to inform the internal approximation of the adult listener. So I promised to do this in raw signal space. So the inputs to the child model or the adult model are images in the reference task. So here the child model needs to learn to project images down into that low dimensional message space, for example, grouping objects and colors in a 2D embedding space. So what we can do here is extract image embeddings using a language revision embedding model, in this case, Meta's Dino V2, then learn a mapping down to a small message space with a simple feed-forward network. You can think of this as a very simple action selection network. Now with this compression, now this compression needs some sort of supervisory signal, as I said. So in this case, we can co-train an acoustic CNN that also outputs to that same low dim embedding, and then do contrastive learning so that we place the acoustic and the image embeddings as close to each other as possible, and the distractor images as far as possible from the acoustic embedding. And this yields relatively nice low dimensional structure, colors and objects patterned fairly regularly, and we can project new images as well as new audio recordings into this joint representational space. That said, we only succeed sometimes with held out combinations when we're using images. So we're still working on techniques to tease out more reliable, a more reliable low dimensional space from the vision model, hence those perpetual delays in the preprint. If instead we use simulated image embedding, so if we make that process of trying to find the regularity in the image, if we just pretend that that's available to the model, and we send synthetic embeddings through, then it's perfectly fine to learn a fully compositional speech representation. So it's the speech part is actually quite trivial once you have the representational space from the images. But trying to get the whole thing, we're still trying to get the whole thing just because we want it as a broader cognitive model, not just a model of speech acquisition. Okay, so let me just bring it all together and clarify how the reinforcement learning fits with the GAN. So what I've described so far fits within the fast child internal simulation loop, everything down on the bottom. We can think of this as a sort of off policy search to build up a good policy and a good value function for the reinforcement learning task. But then periodically, we actually want to do a reinforcement learning episode. We want to know what a caregiver model actually recovers. So we send the child's waveform through the adult speech recognizer, which selects one of the reference. This image is then sent through the child's vision model to produce a latent representation, and the child adjusts their recognizer to better replicate the adult interpretation. So the adult interpretation doesn't act directly on how the child chooses to vocalize. Rather, the child model uses the adult response to refine their own recognition model. And this makes that feedback so much more useful. Okay, so here's some results. We see that the child production model achieves at least a 90% win rate in production, as judged by self-play, when we give it an example of a color and referent combination. So I should say the data set here is 6 objects and 3 colors, all of which are common in early development. And let me just play a couple examples. I have to warn you about one thing first, though, that it's an adult vocal tract simulator. So it definitely sounds a lot older than a child. I probably need to pitch shift this in future work, just because it's a little bit jarring. It's trained on a British speaker also. It's worth a British English speaker. Okay, so see if this works. Sorry, I tested this before lunch. Let me. Oh, well, yes, but I have to, there it is.
Blue ball.
The blue ball.
Green bag.
Green bird. It's not the best red card, but it's, and so these are imperfect, but they're certainly enough in order to identify each of these. And this is not composing waveforms directly. This isn't WaveGAN. This is learning an articulatory program that when you send the articulatory program through a vocal tract simulator, it produces the waveform. So this has to learn mechanisms of vocal control in order to produce that appropriate waveform. Okay, so then on the receptive side for the child, I wanted to say one thing here, that this is after about 20,000 attempts per referent. That's definitely more than what a real human child needs, probably. But that's the model I'm showing here actually does it entirely through self-play. So there's not even a response from the adult that's used to parameterize this. And I want to say there are EMA trajectories for the vocal tract for each of these. Now, on the receptive side for the child, we see near perfect recognition performance. Again, this is all new images, but familiar combinations. But the most interesting thing that we can do here is we can prompt the child model to name an image that it's never seen before previously. So for example, the model never saw a red bird in the input, and then we can give it an input image like this. It saw green birds and it saw bluebirds, and of course it saw other objects that were red, but it never saw a red bird in any of the previous reference games, either in the receptive task or the productive task. And the fun thing here is that it's actually able to produce those combinations in some cases. That's pretty terrible with these speakers. I'm sorry, but even occasional successes here mean that we have some sort of combinatorial representations within the child model's production network that are isomorphic to something like words, that this model has been able to find something like words as acoustic regularities and has learned their correspondence to aspects of images in the input, things that are relevant for its communicative goals. And I want to emphasize again, there's absolutely no text involved anywhere in this process. Text is the devil. All input to the child model, all inputs to the child model were either waveforms or images. Okay, closing out here. So there are a couple other advantages to these models that I want to touch on. The first is that prosody is a first-class citizen. We don't need to add any additional machinery to capture prosody. That's just another aspect of the speech signal that's in a waveform that we can learn. This kind of model very efficiently learns larger vocabularies because that requires only a very slightly larger library of phonological primitives. Even with just 18 of these combinations, you're actually covering a pretty large space of the phonological inventory and a fair amount of the phonotactics. I want to call out also that we could do modality agnostic generation. So today I showed how such a model can learn to use a vocal tract, but you can also imagine learning to articulate with a signed language, moving other articulators on the production side, and of course, it's images or video as inputs on the receptive side. From a computational standpoint, these are quite small models, only tens of millions of parameters. You can run them on a single, very large GPU, but a single GPU, and training is well less than a day. And finally, I think one of the things that we're most excited about in Gaspar's lab right now is that we can see some continuity with non-human communicative systems, that some of the objectives are the same in terms of communication and imitative loss functions, but that the data and maybe representational richness is what seems to distinguish humans and non-human animals. Okay, so that is just cashing out this alternative to the bipartite distinction of language and speech. Instead, we have a single policy, a single model for skills for speech processing and production. And by borrowing heavily from frameworks in robotics, we can start to see an alternative model of early development. Now, we retain a very special respect for abstraction, but we can see that at least interesting abstractions like words can emerge through usage, provided that we have the appropriate representational flexibility in our policy and an idea of what counts as good enough in the course of production. And with that, I'd like to close, acknowledge my co-authors, the labs I've worked in, former and current research assistants, and of course my funding sources. And thank you all for listening. And I'll leave up this slide with an overview of the talk.
Okay, we have some time for questions.
This is very cool. I'm wondering if you have some thoughts on semantic errors that kids might be making. So over extensions, right? If the child calls a kitty a doggy, would the model produce that sort of thing, and would it recover from it in a way that is realistic?
I think so. I haven't gotten to that point yet where we're modeling a large enough or rich enough space to look at that, exactly that kind of semantic overgeneralization error. But I've thought about that kind of overgeneralization error pretty often, actually with Mahesh Srinivasan over in psychology here. We've thought of other models of it, and it should all work perfectly. Yeah, you should both get those models at first, or you should get those sort of errors at first under this model, and then you hopefully get enough variation in the input that those sorts of errors start to recede over time. But that's a fun question. I think the only thing we need to do there is just scale up the kind of data and run for longer and see what happens. I haven't really done an error analysis that would find whether there are overgeneralization errors of that sort in the data we're sending through right now, but that's definitely the sort of thing that we'd like to be able to capture in terms of word learning, right? Like this is a word learning model, and as such, we should be able to capture that kind of phenomenon.
Thank you. The additional component in the end-to-end model, this kind of child's model of the adult listener, that's an interesting gap in the literature that you filled here. I was expecting in terms of the payoff that we would see like what is now the effect of this, the contextual prior, this modeling component that you demonstrated so nicely. Is the model, the end-to-end model that we saw, is that using this child's model of the adult listener, or like what happens if we turn that off? If the child suddenly has this kind of like stringent expectation, does that make a big difference in the learning? You have some comments on what the effects of that?
Sure. Yeah. No. So I'll tell you the intellectual backstory. There is that I gave the first versions of this that I did all had that sort of strong adult supervisory model in them. And then it was Jesse Snedeker at Harvard who said, I'll believe this if you can do it without the adult model in order to account for situations like Nicaraguan Sign Language, et cetera. And I said, okay, Jesse, I'll see you in 2 years. So what it seems to look like right now is that it's the sort of the steepness of the trajectory is influenced, like you just get a faster trajectory with the size of data that we have here. So let me emphasize that this is a fairly small, there's something a little bit toyish in the scope of the model here, that this is only 6 objects and 3 colors. And that's a lot of exposures. There's definitely more exposures in practice. Like the model is practicing to pronounce these words more often than children are. For the one that I showed today, which is without that adult listener component. We still use that adult listener component as the evaluation function. So it's really, really nice to be able to see the win rate against that adult whisper model, rather than have to listen to it exhaustively ourselves, right? Because there's very often, what very often happens in a model like this is that the child's internal model can start to drift. They can start to find a partitioning of the phonological space of the acoustic token space that's different than how you or I say it. So Gasper and I have talked about this a number of times, where there's like models sees a blue ball, says I'm going to encode blue ball, says green car, says great, I said blue ball, right? Like that it's really easy to end up in a deficient part of the space like that, especially if the listening model is over parameterized, because then it's willing to sort of entertain that token of blue ball, which is instead green ball, as an instance of blue ball. So you need to have enough sort of regularization and a small enough architecture that it forces that any production that sounds to you or me like blue ball is also registered as such. So just to go back to your question about the role of that adult listener, right now we think it has certainly just it makes everything happen much faster, and I think it gives us some spiritual guidance in terms of thinking that it's totally fine to go through quite deficient, non-conventional productions as part of the learning process. And one of the things that we've started to do is actually go back and look at phonetic transcriptions and see the differences between the phonetic or phonemic transcriptions and the waveforms. And increasingly, we see that there's actually not even evidence of the phonetic or phonemic transcription, that the waveform, the child is skipping the child is being even more aggressively ungrammatical. And so there's even an idea here that some things like our estimates of the frequency of things like over irregularizations, those might be underestimates. Those might be giant underestimates because if your listener is a noisy channel speaker, they're actually going to map over irregularizations and other very weird productions that might be predicted onto something that's actually within the adult grammar. And so you're actually not able to get a good estimate of how often you see structured and interesting, but highly deviant grammars, especially in the like 2 to 3 range.
One thing that was really surprising to me is that how so much we should ignore the child ignores adult ignores child. So in your results, adults, it's better to ignore those erroneous phonetic forms and make use of your oral knowledge and contextual cues to interpret the child form. For the children, I'll just express myself with the high expectation that you will understand, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah,
very, like,
yeah.
I'm going to ignore you and do whatever way that I want to. So I don't know. So in a sense, so it's as much as the system itself is a holistic and it's interactive, but the individual modules, both the decoder system seems to be quite independent in that sense. So does this give any challenge computationally or maybe conceptually to build this holistic model of the interaction?
Yeah, so the way that I think of it is that so the things that you're describing are on the sort of communicative function of the productions rather than the conventional function of the productions. And it's nice to have that degree of freedom, but I think it's important not to lose sight of the fact that the child does need to approach that conventional part of the system for some combination of social pressures, I think there's probably some argument of once the child hits a larger set of speakers who are less willing to take those sort of, spend that inferential effort to figure out with whom that child has a shorter context, that has less adaptation to the expectations about what that specific child might produce. All of these things make conventionality more and more important. I think maybe the big jump here is that with an architecture and the policy where we're able to decouple those things, you see these interesting cases where the model starts to get really good at the conventional objective, that it's able to start to make things that sound really like speech, but that they're not used in the correct contexts. But it's a pretty trivial switch then to make it so that it is used in the right context, and vice versa, that it can start to have things like communicatively good productions, but that lack a lot of the detail of adult speech, and that the continued existence of that conventionality loss means that it starts to add more. The child model adds more and more detail, even though it's started to satisfy the communicative part. And so that's the way that I think that it works. It supports but doesn't impede further learning, right? To have that much variability, to account to be that accommodating to weird forms.
Thank you so much. This reminds me of one of what my colleague Richard felt.
He's got a few of those, yes.
Moving to the question of what exactly are the normal phonological process, or is it really like communication as a behavior?
So the expectation here is that phonological processes are just something that if you want to communicate, you're going to have to get a pretty good approximation of a lot of those. So it's not an explicit model of anything phonological, right? Like we're not designing it from the bottom up as such. Rather, the idea is that the representations that emerge from this combination of architecture and task are ones that are interesting in some way, that they capture the phonological generalities that we're curious about. So you could imagine doing things like testing for particular consequential phonological generalizations. Here, I was mostly looking at this result of learning like essentially words are emergent here within the model, but you could imagine that this same model would have certain phonological expectations that are non-trivial.
Thanks, Stephan. This is really cool. Like, I buy all of this. I'm a little bit hung up about so if I just primarily what's happening, right? How do I implement or you trying to sort of do a Tom Griffith style, pull the Bayesian symbolic approximation out of the neural loop?
Yep.
Thing, or
Yep.
is there a different way to go?
That's basically my argument. Yeah. No, that's actually I think that's a little bit of it's a little glib, but that's basically how glibly I think of it. So yeah, I think that's approximately right, is that we can design probes, and those probes make use of the symbolic representations in the featural representations that we've used, or that phonologists have used for a long time. Or I guess to go back to Volya's question about generalizations, like that's another case where we actually have all sorts of nice empirical data that's phrased at the word level. And so we can still make predictions, right? We can still make predictions for with respect to observational data that we have. And so yeah,
understanding what's going on is always perfect.
Yeah, and so I think my argument there then is that let me tell you the part that I have worked out on this, which is that I think that this starts to suggest the possibility of decoupling theories of production and processing from theories of language description, right? That you can think of so many of the grammars that are the traditional bread and butter of different parts of the discourse of linguistics as super compressed ways of describing the behavior of the human. And likewise, we can think of super compressed ways of describing behaviors of the neural net. And that's really useful for a lot of tasks. You want that highest level of generality, and you want to keep an emphasis on that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that highest level of generality and phrasing things in terms of sort of precise symbolic representations that are logical is the thing that underlies production and comprehension. So I think, if anything, I'm trying to introduce a substrate, a second substrate. One way to think of this is that this is, and you can slice and dice this model, right? You can slice and dice and ablate this model in ways that you'd never be allowed to with a human. So that's my argument for the utility of these sorts of models.
I think we've had discussions along those lines during lunch, which is pretty wonderful. I think this is a time where we can thank our speaker and continue all the cool discussions.
Thanks, everybody.
We can continue all the cool discussions around here. In 15 minutes, at 3 o'clock, we'll have last session. And after that, we'll just have a conversation, somewhat structured conversation with our wonderful panelists, each of whom is a leader in their field and has been using their approaches, computational approaches, deep learning approaches in phonology. And I think one thing that we can think of is what are the infrastructure that we need to do this kind of research? And also, how do we talk to the world and the machine learning people?
Yes.
About the, can you hear? HDMI.
Okay.
Like you can read this as well if you want.
I think we're cool with that.
You're
Yeah.
cool with that?
Yeah.
All right. And the only other thing is to show your screen.
Okay. It's cool. Yes.
You have to show your screen. Yeah. On Zoom. On Zoom.
On Zoom.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, so that people on Zoom can see.
On Zoom.
Share.
Okay.
Oh,
Let me share. Send the request.